businesses, communities, and nation. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Congratulations, brother. Well, good afternoon. What a great 2 days. I am Miguel Howe, and I am the April and J. Graham Fellow here at the George W. Bush Institute. And at the Bush Institute, we know that by fostering a successful transition for our nation's veterans, we enable a generation of resourceful, determined, and experienced leaders who will continue to serve in new and meaningful ways for the decades to come. As our military service members and their families transition to civilian life, as you heard from Matt, as charged by our 43rd Commander-in-Chief, they have a new leadership assignment to continue to contribute to the security, the economy, and the sustained health of our democracy as veterans. And so for our next panel discussion, Veterans and Military Families, Continuing Leadership for Our Businesses, Our Communities, and Our Nation, I am joined by four extremely distinguished and successful leaders. General Peter Pace culminated a distinguished career in the United States Marine Corps as the 16th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lila Koastani, a Navy veteran, is the co-founder and president of Promote, and she is also a member of our inaugural class of Stand To Veteran Leadership Initiative Scholars. Of course, we've all just met Blaine Smith, president of GORUCK and the recipient of the Military Service Citation. And Meg Cabot comes to us as the National Director of Caregiver Support Programs at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a nice, warm Texas welcome for our panelists. General Pace, sir, if I can start with you. You served President Bush as both the vice chairman and then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You know the president and our military in a very, very special way in this room. We currently have, as Matt described, over 2 million people that are serving in the United States today. But who are these men and women, and what makes them assets as leaders after they take off the uniform?
They're our sons and our daughters. And they're our neighbors and our brothers and our sisters. They're the kid down the block who grew up and went off to serve the country. And they've joined our military and your military for various reasons. Patriotism for sure, but some also see the GI Bill as a way to pull themselves up. Others join because they want to not only serve the country, but learn a skill that they can then transition back to civilian life and continue to grow their families. But regardless of why they joined, after they go through boot camp and they join their first unit and they go on deployment, they are members of an incredible brotherhood and sisterhood. And if they have drawn the straw that puts them into combat directly, they have learned a love of fellow soldier, Marine, Airman, Coast Guardsman, sailor. They've learned a love that you can only learn on the battlefield. And they've also learned what it's been for this country for some 244 years to have individuals like themselves who are willing to sacrifice themselves for our country. And when they come back to this country from deployment, they don't think they've earned anything. but they certainly understand the kind of sacrifices needed for us to continue to be the free society we are. They have found out that they can stretch themselves mentally and physically beyond anything they ever dreamed they could do. They found a brotherhood and a sisterhood that they didn't know existed. They've learned to lead by making decisions and making mistakes and learning from their mistakes. They are dedicated Americans. And when they come back, we need about 20% to stay on active duty beyond 4 years. And we actually need the other 80% to go home. And they want to go home. And they want to have the opportunity to participate in the society that they just helped defend. And that's why it's such a delight for me personally and for my wife, Lynn, to be here today with the President, Mrs. Bush, all of you, because what we're doing here today is continuing the bond between the citizens of the United States and your military. Less than 1% of our population defends the rest of us every day. Cumulatively, that means 8 to 10% of the population at any one time are veterans. They're proud of that. But importantly, for each of you in this room, is the message that you send to each of them by what you do here today and what you do day to day in your lives. Because the most important thing to your service members, beyond their oath of office to defend our Constitution, is that they do so in a way that earns the respect of the American people. And when you thank them in an airport for their service, when you contribute whatever way you do, financially and otherwise, to help them, that sends a huge message to them about how much they're valued and appreciated. I no longer have the privilege of speaking for all of our active duty men and women, but if I did, I know I could say to you, each of you, for each of them, thank you for your support and all you do to make them understand how important they are to us. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. So, Blaine, Lila, you were two of those post 9/11 veterans who have come home. And there are 4 million of our citizens and residents who have had that same service. 200,000 of our service members transition into civilian life every year. And you know, oftentimes we see them lifted up either as heroes or sometimes seen as victims. But I want to ask you both, how do you see your fellow post 9/11 veterans leading and serving today?
Sure. So I think the first thing to maybe point out is that the military is a very diverse place. And so a veteran is not a veteran is not a veteran. They came from different places. They served in different ways. Their experiences were different. And so what they need and how they can contribute and how they feel when they exit the military is also going to be very diverse. So I think that's the first thing that we have to recognize, is that we can't just say veteran and assume that means one thing or some small list of things. It's a cross-section of America, and that's one of the things that makes it so great, as General Pace pointed out. But in terms of how I see them contributing post-service, it's also in a very diverse set of ways. And so there are ways that we can point to that are very recognizable. You see guys like Jake Wood leading Team Rubicon and J.J. Pinter leading Team RWB. And you see people like Alex Gorski leading Johnson & Johnson, right? So you see people that are in the public eye that are doing things that are making a huge impact, and we can recognize it. But I think probably more importantly, there are a lot of veterans that are coming home, taking off the uniform, and they're going to work to put food on the table, to feed their family, to make businesses better, to make their communities better, whether that's in a professional setting or in a civic setting. And just one anecdote, when I left the military, I went to work in corporate America. I got a job. I was very fortunate to have some people usher me into a good job at Quest Diagnostics, which is a big corporation. And they gave me a job doing something I had never done before in my life. And the only reason I was able to have that opportunity and have that job is because there were 6 or 7 military veterans who had gone to work there over the previous 3 or 4 years and had just been killing it, right? And so they were willing to now not only accept a military veteran into their ranks and take a little bit of a chance on me, they were actually getting to the point where they were eagerly starting to recruit and pursue military veterans to come in, only because other veterans had gone before and had not been entitled, had not expected anything other than an opportunity to make their sales number or lead their team or contribute to the success of the business. And so they didn't look at me as much of a risk. And as a result, I got an awesome job and I was able to transition out smoothly from a professional perspective. And then I did a good job at the organization, and it sort of continues the cycle. And so they're doing it in a lot of ways, but one of the most important ways is just to go to work every day and lead by example.
Which really speaks to the responsibility that veterans learn in uniform and need to bring back to our nation. And so, you said all veterans are unique. Lila, before you answer that question, can you share a little bit about your veteran and American story? And then also talk about how and where you see veterans.
Sure. So I'm an Afghan immigrant whose family came to the United States during the anti-Soviet jihad timeframe in the 1980s, and I have an older brother who is in the military, who's retired now, have a sister-in-law who's still on active duty, so we're very much military family. And joining the military was a way to absolutely pick ourselves up by our bootstraps as immigrants, and we have created phenomenal lives for each other and then been able to impact many other people as a result. How I see veterans serving, and I absolutely agree with Blaine, is they're taking the leadership that they've learned and applying it every day wherever they are. But I'm also very encouraged by the veterans that I see in the advocacy space. And so I'm glad that there are more veterans that are running for office. I'm glad to see more women veterans running for office. I'm glad to see that there is an increase in the number of women veterans that are starting businesses in this country and contributing somewhere around $20 billion to our economy. I'm excited to see more veterans coming out and talking about immigration and why we should protect refugees that come to this country. And the way that I see them leading is pragmatically and collaboratively. So veterans are doing more to come together with other veterans, but also non-veterans. And we're well poised to do this because in the military, as you mentioned, we come from all diverse walks of life, and we have to work together, and we very quickly learn to work on teams with people who are different from us. And when we're deployed in different parts of the world, we often have to work with people who are very different from us. And so when you have veterans coming into this advocacy space and saying, enough is enough with the polarization, we need to work together, we need to come together to live our values, the values that we have fought for, I think we're extremely well poised to bring the country back together in a way that perhaps other sectors of society cannot.
And so we know through President Bush and Mrs. Bush's leadership that in our own experiences, that when someone serves in the military, their entire family serves. And so when we talk about veterans at the Bush Institute, that is inclusive of their family members and their caregivers. Meg, you are responsible for programs and services to a special population of family members, and that's our caregivers. There are 5.5 million military caregivers in the United States today. And typically when you are speaking in these kind of forums, you're really rightfully focused on what we need to empower that population. Can you talk a little bit about that, but can you talk about how you see leadership on the part of our caregivers and family members?
Absolutely. To start out, right, when we talk about caregivers, we know that service members come home from conflict with all sorts of different things going on, and they may need differing levels of support than a non-service member. And so when we talk about caregiving, I really want to emphasize that I'm talking about it on a real continuum. At one end, we have family members and friends who are touching base with service members more frequently because they're concerned about them. And then at the high end, we have family members who are taking care of catastrophically injured individuals. They're doing things like special diets and helping them get in and out of wheelchairs and all kinds of other medical tasks. And so what we've learned over the past 15 years or so at this point is that supporting those family members who have to do that kind of support to veterans actually helps the veterans. And so when I started in this role, we used to talk about caregiver support as something because it was the right thing to do. Caregivers had sacrificed so much themselves for the veteran that they love. But now that we've been at it for a while, we have research and all kinds of data that lets us know that if we support those caregivers, they actually can do better in supporting that veteran. That veteran accesses more health care. They're more likely to be in treatment if we're supporting that caregiver. So it's not just about doing the right thing. It's also about really impacting veterans. So I think what is different with this post 9/11 generation of family caregivers is that they're really demanding change. They're demanding change in a lot of our institutions. And certainly at the Department of Veterans Affairs, caregivers have a very loud voice. And they have collectively made a huge impact in passing some significant pieces of legislation around things like the post 9/11 stipend program that I run, but also even just at lunch we were talking about legislation to allow veterans receive infertility treatments through VA because of injuries. So, I think that they have learned that they have a voice and they're using that voice. And really, when I think about the impact of them within the context of VA, I know that well outside of VA, there's a lot of healthcare reform out there that we need to do. And so I think the non-federal healthcare system can look at the caregivers that I work with and know well as really ways to think about how we can make changes to healthcare across the country that will impact all of us.
That's really an incredible way to think about it, Meg, is that our nation is really getting a threefer, in terms of meeting our moral responsibilities to ensure the care of these men and women. But by taking care of the caregiver, we enable two leaders. The caregiver who's, at the end of the day, we've heard many definitions of leadership in the past 2 days, and one of those is the art of influence. And so we see enabling these leaders, but also those that they care for. Mike Rodriguez is sitting in the back of the room, and even those service members seriously wounded continue to lead and influence. So a great threefer. So
I've got to jump in on families. Our military families, your military families, serve this nation as well as anybody who's ever had the privilege of wearing a uniform. I mean, when you are a service member, it's a great honor to serve the country, but it gets tiring sometimes. And when we get tired, our family members dust us off and tell us how important what we're doing are and remind us how important the mission is. And when we deploy, they stay home and they pray for us that we won't get injured. And if we're lucky and do not get injured, and we do come home, they take a step back and we get awards and citations and we get promotions, and they pretend like they had nothing to do with it. They had everything to do with it. And then as Meg has pointed out, once our family members come back, our wounded come back, our family members are the ones who pick up the pieces of the family and have to keep it tied together. And in fact, live with it then for the rest of their lives. And our kids, I volunteered. My wife kind of volunteered when she married me, but our kids didn't get a vote. Yet, they are serving this country as well because we jerk them around from post to post and school to school. Yet, they stand proud because they understand the importance. So I just couldn't let the family go by without jumping on board and saying, this nation is so well served by our military families.
So last fall, President Bush issued a very important address at this moment in time for our country on the spirit of liberty at home and in the world, addressing freedom, free markets, and security. He called for projecting American leadership abroad, hardening our defenses at home, strengthening American citizenship, as we've heard over the course of the past 2 days, and restoring trust in democratic institutions, also something that we've been discussing over the past 2 days. So I'd like to start with General Pace and Lila in terms of how can our veterans meet those first two imperatives, help to harden our defenses at home after they take off their uniform, and to continue to project American leadership abroad?
Sir, please.
Well, as Lila and Blaine have already pointed out, the beauty of our armed forces is it's just a melting pot. In your Marine Corps, we don't have black Marines or white Marines. We have light green Marines and dark green Marines because it's all about being green. It's all about being a Marine. And I think in all of our armed forces, all of the biases that you might bring with you from whatever community you came melt away when faced with the kind of dangers that are being faced. And that knowledge, that understanding, having lived in a homogeneous community called the military, can be transferred directly back to civilian society as examples of how to be a good partner with somebody of a different religion or a different skin color. Just as fundamental human decency. But they bring back incredible skills. They bring back, as I said, the knowledge of the strength of this country and how lucky we are to be living here. But when you deploy overseas, we don't deploy to Paris. We don't deploy to Barcelona. We deploy to Mogadishu. We deploy to Bagram and Baghdad. What that means is every night you go to sleep, you are saying to yourself, man, I cannot wait to get home, because you realize how precious what we have here in the United States is. So you bring that home with you as well, and you share that with your fellow citizens. And if you get out, you might be able to help in technical fields, law enforcement, teaching, mentoring, coaching, you name it. Any walk of life in this country. And that strengthens us here at home. And as some of the folks have talked about here on the stage earlier today, there's a real problem in our nation right now with extremes. And folks in the military have learned, if they came with extremes, to disabuse themselves of that. And then overseas, I don't know a lot about Somalia, but I know 1 year's worth of experience, 9 months, excuse me, in Somalia. I know about the places I've deployed, as do all of your military members. That means that we can come home and be a resource about that region to our country, both in a way of helping ourselves understand how we might work, but also importantly as an outreach to them. I'm now going to a country I never thought I would ever go to, because I happen to have some experience in that country trying to help that country transform its military. And when they do, it'll be good for them and it'll be great for us. These are the kinds of things that our military brings back home with them, that if properly understood, recognized, and put into the right places, can enormously benefit our society, both here at home and overseas. Lila?
He stole all of my comments.
Well, Lila, can you also share a little bit more about how you were serving overseas after you took off the uniform?
Sure, yes. So my very first deployment was in uniform in 2005, and it was with the Special Operations community. And I loved supporting the Special Operations community, and sadly, I couldn't keep doing it while I was in uniform because I basically chose the wrong service. I was in the Navy, and Afghanistan is a landlocked country.
I did not pay her to say that.
So, yes, I should have either joined the Army or the Marine Corps. I chose incorrectly. So I couldn't go back to Afghanistan. There was no way for me to continue going back. So I got out of the military and became a defense contractor and worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for 6 years, deployed 2 more times, once in 2011, and then again a full year from 2013 to 2014 supporting special operations in Afghanistan. But even after that time at DIA, I've continued to support Special Operations Command as an instructor and as an advisor. So I train all of the men and women that are going to Afghanistan that are supporting the Special Ops mission. So just because you take the uniform off does not mean that your spirit of service goes away. And I think once you do create these bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood, you want to keep seeing those teams and those people come back. You want to see their families whole, and you want to do everything that you can to support that. So in addition to what I would consider the traditional routes of continuing your service, becoming a government civilian, becoming a contractor, there are many other ways. There are ways for us to project our power by being involved in the national security apparatus here, by helping to shape foreign policy. And why I think it's so important for veterans to be involved in that space is because we can hold other veterans accountable. We can hold the executive accountable. I hear comments that give me pause. You and I talked about this. When I hear people say you shouldn't get into an argument with a 4-star, I reject that comment. I reject that because this is a democracy and we should be able to hold our leaders accountable in a democracy. And so whereas civilians may feel at times a little reticent to get into this dynamic engagement with a military senior leader, other veterans are not, because they know our lives are at stake and our families' lives are going to be impacted by these decisions. So I want more veterans to be involved in the foreign policy decision making back here as well.
So I'm sitting next to a Green Beret, but this might be the bravest person sitting up here on the panel this afternoon. Blaine, I want to turn to you and Meg to talk a little bit about the economy. You know, clearly education and the economy have been two of the themes running through the conference this week. But before I do need to give you the opportunity to say, what does it mean to be the inaugural Military Service Citation recipient?
Can we just skip to the... So it's bewildering. See, there you go. It's bewildering to be here, to be honest. It's very surreal in that when I wore the uniform, I cared really about two things. I cared first about my team and making sure that they were taken care of, and I cared second about defending this little experiment that we call America and our democracy. And it was really always that simple. When you get way out at the business end of things, life can get pretty simple, regardless of the complexities of the geopolitical space and all of that. And then when I left the military, I made all the mistakes that so many of the veterans we see are making. I struggled in a lot of ways. I did well professionally, but I struggled at home. I struggled with my sense of identity. And it was only through the support of my friends and my family and good organizations, the VA even, the post-deployment clinic at the James A. Haley Hospital in Tampa. I had a lot of help and a lot of support from people that helped me sort of find my way and get into the veterans space. And really all I wanted to do was to try to help my fellow veterans and their families from suffering some of the same pitfalls that I went through. I figured if I can get someone before they stumble, that's better. I don't have to pick them up off the ground. I can just point out the obstacle. And the other thing is I wanted to pay forward all the support and help that I was given. And so I had a chance to do that over a period of 5 years at Team RWB, and that mission just exploded and took off because I think it really resonated with people that we just want to help veterans and their families connect with their communities in a meaningful way. And so I'm proud of the organization, I'm proud of the work that we've done, and I'm proud to represent them and all the people that supported me here. And I have to thank President Bush and the entire Institute, because the level of authenticity, the level of passion and commitment that you all have committed to this mission, it is the real deal. I've never seen anything like it. To be able to sit at a table with President Bush last year at the Warrior Wellness Alliance meeting and to see how much he cared genuinely about what we were doing, that lights a fire in you that makes you want to go to work every day and do your small part of the mission. So I'm honored to be here on behalf of a lot of people.
And he embodies 4 million who have worn the uniform and all their family members. How about that? Okay, so now we can go back to the question. So how do we see, how can we better integrate our veterans to help grow our businesses, to help grow and sustain markets, to meet critical gaps within our workforce? You know, you've spent quite a bit of time in both the private and the nonprofit sector. You're in the private sector now. How do you see that? And then Meg, when you get a chance to jump in, really interested to hear on how you see that impact in the healthcare sector.
So I think that the curve, if you want to look at the list of total available opportunities to make an economic impact on sort of a bell curve, I think that we tend to really lionize people that are at either end of the curve, so to speak, in terms of the opportunities. And so there are a lot of veterans and there are a lot of people out tackling enormous problems, you know, international problems, clean water, AIDS, immigration, huge issues. And I think that's absolutely where we need some of our best and brightest veterans. And then you see other veterans, what I would call the other end of the curve, working on technology, innovation, you know, social platforms, things that are, again, they're very recognizable and they're lionized for their pioneering vision in business. I think what we miss too often, though, and not that both those things aren't great and important, but I think under the fat part of the curve is a tremendous opportunity to get into service industry businesses, small business, local business. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of Americans out there that don't really care to have a better app for where to find dinner, and maybe it doesn't impact their life directly about a clean water well in East Africa, but they have a million problems that need to be solved for them on where they buy groceries, how they get to work every day, infrastructure, local politics, all of those things. And so I certainly don't want to sit here and say that we shouldn't be going after the ends of the curve, but I think that veterans should be looking for ways to contribute to businesses and opportunities that serve the biggest number of people in their community, in their state, and in the country. And so that might be buying a plumbing business from a 55-year-old that's getting ready to retire. That might be starting a small business or restaurant on the corner of your street. But I just think the opportunity is enormous out there for people that are energetic and hungry and smart to go carve out their way. And then if it grows big and it explodes and they become famous, that's great. But I don't think you have to necessarily be on the cover of Wired magazine to be making a big difference in the economic impact toward our country.
And before Meg jumps in here, let me just ask. We heard Doug talk about 7,000 veterans within American Airlines. You run a small, mid-sized business with a number of veterans as part of that as well. Can you all talk a little bit about what do you see as the employer's responsibility to harness this talent? And then what is, you talked some, but what would you challenge the veterans in terms of how to seek out and leverage and contribute back to our economy and the health of our businesses?
Go ahead. You want
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
That's why I asked you.
So I think for employers, it's immediately to make the shift from how do I go from hiring veterans to how do I go from growing and keeping veterans to make an impact on my business. And the good news is we're really seeing that shift. 5 years ago, if I was on this panel, we'd talk about we got to hire 1 million veterans, we got to do that. I think we're starting to see a very positive shift in that direction. And we need to understand that veterans don't just need a job, they need a career, but also that career needs to fulfill some things in them beyond just putting bread on the table. And so whether that's giving them time off of work to volunteer, to be engaged in their community, or finding resource groups within their business to, social impact initiatives, corporate responsibility, all of those things. Veterans are looking for more out of a job than just the paycheck. And so whether you can do that internal to the business, allow them opportunities outside the business, I think that is absolutely huge. And the other big piece of it is you've got to push them and you've got to challenge them. I know when I got out of the military and got a job being a sales manager at a large corporation, my boss didn't care about anything other than whether or not I was making my sales goal every quarter. And I dutifully made that goal, and he was very proud of me, and they compensated me for it, and that was awesome. So I think veterans will respond to the challenge. You can't take them on as a charity project. You've got to bring them in as an asset and then hold them accountable and push them hard to make the goal.
So, Meg, as we talked about some of the workforce development challenges, and there's been a lot of discussion about how veterans can and should be filling STEM requirements. But our healthcare system is one that is tremendously stressed and that you see firsthand, both on the government side, but also in your partnership on the civilian side. Can you talk a little bit on where you see veterans and family members really impacting that part of our economy?
Sure. I think it's important to think back even over the history of our country that, during the Revolution, it was the it was the wives and the kids who stayed home and did the farming. You know, you look at World War II and all of the women that went to work for the first time because their spouses or significant others were off at war. And so certainly in this new generation of veterans, the same is true. There were the individuals who stayed home, the spouses, and certainly not as just women anymore, spouses, but those spouses were going to school, they were running families, they were doing community organizing on their bases or within their Guard and Reserve units. And so those are all really important assets, and we need to figure out ways to continue to support them. And I think I really like what you said about how we would have been talking about how to hiring veterans, and now we're sort of talking, we're at the next step. I think we're still in that same step about families and hiring them. There's often pieces of legislation about licensure for spouses of military veterans so they can be a licensed nurse in one state and then move easily and become licensed in the next. And in other areas, those are important things. But certainly at the very local level, at the local school system, at the local firehouse, those families who learned how to adapt rapidly, move from one place to another, and figure out how to build a community around them, all those skills really translate into the communities. And so I think we need to make sure that we embrace these families. We don't set up barriers, policies around, you know, if you're, you're going to deploy in June, then you can't join the community pool because you still have to pay the full year. These are small things, but they can make a huge impact for that family, but also the rest of the community. I hear terrible stories about children on sports teams who sometimes can't get on the travel team because they might have to move. And so those are the kinds of things where the previous generation of the veterans as opposed to that active duty family can really make an impact on the next group sort of coming through. So those are some of the different areas that I see them. And again, for me, it's really about the advocacy. I feel like we have, there's really a generation of families of service members who are demanding more. And I really value that, certainly in the work that I do within my program. But I think more and more there is a voice about not accepting the status quo, and we need to embrace that really fully, especially in healthcare.
So we're running out of time, but I do just want to ask very quickly. We heard Dina Powell and Barbara Barrett and Holly Kuzmich talk about the lost trust in institutions. And we've talked quite a bit over the past 2 days about the need for civic leadership and developing civic responsibility in our young people. So in our last 2 minutes, I want to ask the panel, how do you see veterans contributing to both of those things, strengthening our institutions and developing civic responsibility in our youth? Lila.
I'm really heartened when I see veterans signing up for Big Brothers and Big Sisters programs. I think it's a huge, impactful way to give back to your community at a very local level. And also some of these phenomenal programs that I've heard about, like through the Chicago YMCA, something called Urban Warriors, which some of you may have heard about, where there are veterans who have been in combat that are being paired up with low or high-risk individuals in urban areas, and they're both talking about the trauma of being in a war zone because these at-risk youth are seeing so much violence in their local neighborhoods. These programs are taking place in Colorado, they're taking place in the DC area as well. It's really heartening for me to see that we are trying to teach these young folks through our experiences, and maybe sometimes we don't have much in common with them, maybe sometimes we do, but telling them at a very young age that there is a responsibility that you have to as you get mentored, to then mentor a future generation.
Yeah, so it's leadership by example. That's what we've got to do, and I'll put myself squarely on the the list of hypocrites in that I think that veterans should run for office and should hold public office, and yet I look at myself and I'm like, I don't want to do that, man. That seems terrifying, right? So I'll just openly admit that. But I think that, to your point, veterans have to step into the breach and get into some of these uncomfortable situations, because the military is the only public institution that enjoys more than 50% approval from the American public, and so those folks have to step in and inject themselves into these larger institutions.
So I might, yeah, I heard some applause out there, right there. And so I think that leadership by example is an appropriate way to end this panel. I'm going to have to be as brave as Lila and say, if you want to hear additional insights from a 4-star and from Meg, who is empowering, really, when you think about it, 10 million people through her work. Thanks to Lila, thanks to Blaine. Our veterans are assets for our businesses, for our communities, for our nation to address 21st century challenges. How about a round of applause for our panelists as we close? And so, for the past 2 days, we have heard our speakers address women's empowerment, lifelong learning, education, and workforce development, fostering economic growth and global competitiveness, better serving those who have served us, and the opportunities and obligations to ensure human freedom. These are some of the pressing 21st century challenges that our nation faces today. And we have also heard that during these fractured, polarized